Hey everyone, and welcome to the Hey Woman podcast. We're going to start today by talking about our vacations when we were kids. So I used to spend probably most of my summers. I would go up to Maine for a couple of weeks, so my grandparents would rent a condo, and then, in like 2007, they bought a place up there. And so my mom, so you would take us up.
Drop
us off. And so drive from Pennsylvania to Maine, which, I mean, this is before Easy Passes. That was, I can remember sitting in New Hampshire for
Or you had to have your quarters. Throw your
The
quarters in to get through, the tolls.
I still have a change purse in my Bronco, which feels semi-unnecessary with my Easy Pass. But, old habits, they die hard. My sister Stephanie and I, DJ was there, right?
Yeah, he was. You may not remember him, but he was. I dropped all three of you off to Nana.
Yep, so she dropped us all off. And, before you used to take us to Toys R Us. And I don't know if you ever knew this, but, we were allowed to get one toy. And so,
that was plenty for you.
Yep, one toy a kid. And I remember making my decisions very quickly, but, Steph, my sister, a little bit more of a perfectionist, took her a little bit of time to make the decisions. So, while she was, browsing.
And we're going today for her to get her a wedding dress.
So that could be.
I'm not sure we'll be able to make the decision today, but I'm hopeful. But anyways, yeah.
So, but while she was doing that, you go up and down all the aisles, and there would be a couple more toys that would, catch my attention. And so, I think Nan and Pap knew that. And so you would leave in that day, and the 45 minutes it takes to get from the main line to New Hampshire. I don't even think it took that long before they took us back to Portland, back to the Toys R Us. But it's all the toys that we wanted. No parents, no rules. It was really how, those weeks were. You spent the time with Nan and Pap right on the ocean. And, we kind of share this story. We're going to talk about this a little bit, but I think it's important for people to understand, we spent so much time up there with them, and it was such a fun way to spend a summer as a kid with my grandparents, and we go out to dinner, and you'd go to the beach, and that's where we learned to go swimming. We used to buy our Halloween costumes up there, so there's all these pictures of us as little kids with our Halloween costumes in August, because you had to try it on to make sure it fit, right? And so that was just the time that you had to take us, which was always fun. And, we still have that place, and it's, 2025, and, my Nan passed away in 2024, and that's what brings us to this podcast. So my name is Cortney, and I'm here with my mom, Julie, and we're really here to talk about my Nan and all the things that she taught us in her life and her legacy, and we dedicate this podcast to her. And we're going to talk about caregiving, and we're going to talk about the ups and downs and the emotions and all of that great stuff that really comes from that.
Yeah, and we hope that for the people that are listening, you get some actionable advice, but that also that you don't feel alone, and that you get the fact that caregiving is hard. Raising kids is hard. Being married is hard. Life can be hard sometimes, but you're not alone. We're certainly here. Think of this podcast, Hey Woman, as a phone call to you to talk to somebody who's been there and has been through it. I am an elder law and estate planning attorney, so we can't not talk about some of those types of things. And when we think about, can we go back? Yeah. Okay. Because I forgot the part about when you walked into the apartment. I wanted to just say that. Okay. So Hey Woman was a term of endearment that all the grandkids used with their Nana. They would walk into their apartment and say, Hey Woman. And we'd talk about a lot of the lessons that we learned. And today, as an elder law and estate planning attorney, I want to talk a little bit about how important it is to plan ahead for people. I know firsthand how important that is. And I'm not going to today, we're not going to get into all of the ups and downs of wills and trusts and everything.
Thank goodness. I mean, honestly, I do work in that world, but that's kind of a lot.
But I think that, in my mom's situation, we certainly did plan ahead and we made it easier because we did have the proper things in place, but it was still hard.
It was.
It was still hard. There's still things. But I think for everybody listening, the number one document, it doesn't matter where you live in the U.S., the number one document everybody needs to have is powers of attorneys. And they're documents that say if for some reason you can't make your own decision, or the person that you're caregiving for can't make their own decision, this is who they want to make those decisions. And that is so important because, people come to my office in a crisis situation, and all of a sudden I have this, older person who has, 4 people with them, or 1 person and 2 other people that aren't there. And my biggest question is, who do they want me to listen to? Like, who do they want to speak for them? Who's their decision maker? And that fundamentally is what a power of attorney is. We'll talk a little bit more about them, but a power of attorney is designating, this is who I want to speak for me. Powers of attorneys can be, healthcare. They can be financial. We can call them all kinds of things in this country. We can call them advanced directives. We can call them healthcare proxies. We also get into, what's called to as like a living will, which is, not the best name at all. It's really an advanced directive for healthcare. It's saying today, this is what I want. And I don't want to get into so much, what those documents say or what they have to say. I really want to kind of focus my time on thinking about, one, you need them. Everybody needs them.
When you believe that so strongly, as all of us turned 18, so all of us kids, myself, my sister Steph, and DJ, that was our 18th birthday present. And that's how you know that you grow up with an elder law attorney for a mom. A lot of kids get all these great 18th birthday presents. That's when you become an adult, right? You can do all these things. You get powers of attorney.
Yeah, well, I don't know why you don't think that wasn't a great present.
It was expensive.
Not for me.
Right.
Yeah, absolutely. But we want to know, who you want to speak for you, and that's so important because, some of the documents there, you can read articles about, the living will has failed. And that's because it's really hard to put in black and white what happens if I get run over by a car, have dementia, die of cancer. So it's really hard. But what we do know is who do you want the doctor to talk to? Who can speak for you and be your voice? And I think that's so important. So there are healthcare powers of attorneys and living wills. And as I indicated, they could be called different things. But it's basically somebody who can talk when you can't or don't want to, or, who can advocate for you. And in this country, in the healthcare industry that we have, it's really important to have a voice. It's really important to have somebody who can talk for you and ensure that you get good care and advocate for that. So we want to have those documents so that we know who it is that we're going to talk to. Same thing is true with financial documents, financial powers of attorneys. We want to know who is it that should pay your bills. And so I want to talk a little bit about who that decision maker could be or should be. And it's funny, in my office, sometimes I've represented people and they've picked children or loved ones. And then we went to use the document and I wonder, why did they pick that person? And I think some people come with preconceived notions that it has to be the oldest child. Although, Court, you would think that's probably
as the oldest child, I would make the right decisions.
Yeah.
Right,
But, what I like to say to people is, and I'm always asking, does it matter where they live? And I don't know that it does, anymore. I always say to my clients, if you're in a car accident tomorrow, who would you want to talk to the doctor? Who would come to the hospital? That's important. And who could pay your bills? It kind of comes down to that. And so first, the person has to be able to do the job, And so if your child cannot balance their own checkbook, they are not a good choice for your financial power of attorney, even if they're the ones that want to be. And so I think it's really important that you not make a decision based on who wants to do the job, but rather really honestly who can do a good job for you. And it can be in some states, it's, it can just be one person, but in many states, it can be more than one person. In many states, they can act as an and, which means they have to do everything together. That's a really nice checks and balances. So if it has to be two people doing that, one can't like run off with the money.
Which is always a concern, right?
It is. It is. Although I have to be honest with you, if you have that concern, they're probably not the best decision
That's
maker.
true. That could be a good gut check. Do you think like I have to add an and because they might take my money? Maybe we just don't give them the power to do that.
I know.
Right?
Yeah. Yeah. And it also can be an or, which means either or can act. And if we take this back to, in my mom's circumstance, Nana, who this podcast is about, hey woman, she appointed me and my brother as an or. And that worked out really well for us. But it worked out really well for us because Buddy and I were able to communicate with each other and respected each other's decisions. Like if he was at the hospital by himself, he talked to the doctor, he made the decision, he let me know. And the same thing was true of me. So we communicated with each other, but we didn't, it wasn't that either one of us did. We both knew that we would make the best decision possible for our mom. And so as an or, it was nice because we could tag team.
And I think it's also really important, just talking about like, I don't want to get into like the state of healthcare, but hospitals
But
are,
you're gonna.
but I know, just a little bit if you'll indulge this rabbit hole. I think it's important to talk about hospitals it's a big building. There's lots of people. And I think now more than ever, like, when Nan would be in the hospital, there's multiple nurses, there's doctors, you're dealing with all different things. And anytime you put a couple of different departments or a couple of different people together, what you're really doing is making the best decision you can with the information that you had at the time. And that's why I think you and Uncle Buddy worked so well. It's because even if you would have made a different decision 6 hours later when you got to the hospital because you were working and Uncle Buddy had that shift or different things like that, Uncle Buddy maybe didn't have that information.
Right.
And I think that's an important distinction that, the two of you never got mad at each other for the decision that you made, because that might have been the right decision with the information that he had. Information doesn't always flow through hospitals in the most efficient manner. And that is not at all a criticism on the phenomenal doctors and nurses that Nan had.
Mm-hmm.
It really is just a victim of the system sometimes.
Yeah, it's definitely a systems issue. And I think, sometimes I think, people could be listening and saying, well, I can't, have that same conversation with my siblings or that same situation. And first of all, I would say, well, then, whoever's deciding who should be the power of attorney, maybe should just pick one,
Right.
because you have to have decision-making authority. But that's going to be more cumbersome for that one person. They're going to be, having to do it themselves. But I also would say to you, as being the person who's watched families argue and fight, usually the fight is less about what's happening right now and the decision as it is that, maybe the person who decided to put a loved one discharged to a nursing home and, don't take any offense, kid, the out-of-town kid is upset about that. Maybe they're really not upset about that fact that decision was made, except for they're upset about the disease and where we're at. And they're not ready to accept that. They have to deal with it themselves. And so if I was, the person who was making the decision, maybe the sibling, and I was having trouble with my other sibling, as we caregive and, these transitions and, information, should somebody still drive, should somebody be at home, and we're on opposite sides. I think you have to really understand that probably both of you want what's best for your loved one, but you might really just be having trouble getting there because, it's your own grief and letting go. I know it was hard for me at times, like, I didn't want my mom to have to go through these things. I didn't want my mom to have to go to a rehab for, 2 weeks after being in a hospital. in my circumstance, I was really lucky that my brother and I were always, tagging each other. And in fact, quite honestly, this podcast is about Nana. And we talked in our first episode about some of her idiosyncrasies. She could fight hard.
Oh, yeah.
And she was fiercely independent, fiercely. And so she wasn't always happy about the decisions that were being made. But,
sometimes you're up against a deadline.
Yes.
And nobody could get her to fall in, like she was not somebody that was falling in line with the system.
Yeah.
But nobody could get her to do that like Uncle Buddy could.
Absolutely. Absolutely. In fact, and you have to kind of be okay with some of that. Like I knew as the daughter, and given our relationship, which could be more explosive, that sometimes I had to tag my brother in because she could get him to do things I couldn't get her to do. Now she still wasn't overly happy about it, but she
No, but she did it.
She
and
did
right? It. And that made a huge difference in her care and the ability for like Uncle Buddy to really like bring the hammer down. And like, you will do this. Even Steph and I were able to say things to her that like, God, if you could have never, like she never wanted to use her walker. And part of that was her independence.
Mm-hmm.
And I just looked at her the one day and I said, woman, I don't have time to take you to the emergency room. And she just laughed and she went and got her walker. No, if you had said that, that would have gone very differently.
Yeah, she probably would have thrown the walker at me.
And, realistically, she knew that if she did have to go to the emergency room, I would have been the first person that would have taken her, right? But, she just like laughs and she gets her walker and then she's like bebopping around her little place. And, but some of that was her trying to take control in a situation that she didn't have a lot of control.
Yeah. And so if you're listening, we're talking about, choosing a decision maker for a power of attorney. And the power of attorney document is really important because we have to have somebody who has power to make decisions if your loved one's not able to. If you don't have a power of attorney, we could end up in the courts with what's called in some states a guardianship and in other states a conservatorship. But basically what we're doing is we're petitioning the court to say this person can no longer make their decisions and we need somebody who can do that. And in any state, any time you're in a court, there's all kinds of protections that cost more time and money. So we, in Pennsylvania where I practice law, we're going to file the petition. We're going to have a guardian ad litem, another attorney appointed to make sure, let's say this was in my mom's circumstance and I was petitioning the court for my mom, then we're going to have an attorney who's appointed to protect my mom's interests, rightly so, because there's a lot of bad actors out there. And so it becomes this really time-consuming situation that requires a lot of money and can take a while to get through the different court systems. And so, and then on top of that, people can fight then about who's supposed to be that decision maker. And the judge doesn't know what that older person wants. And so it doesn't always put people on equal footing. Maybe one sibling's more able to afford an attorney as their voice. And so, again, a power of attorney is a very simple document. In some states, there's statutory forms, but there's a very simple document that says, if for some reason I'm still alive and I can't make my own decisions, this is who I want to speak to me. And powers of attorneys will cover healthcare issues, financial issues, end-of-life issues. And if you're listening today and you're caregiving for somebody or you're worried about your own, well, as Cortney will tell you, everybody over the age of 18 really should have a power of attorney because we never know when we're in a car accident. And even those of you who might be listening, maybe you have a child who has a special need and you're used to, making decisions for that person. Understand all kids, once they turn 18, the parents no longer have that say. And so we have to get a guardianship. And if I were to talk about one thing that every family should do, it is really to get powers of attorneys. And certainly helped in my mom's situation. We certainly had those powers of attorneys. And just so you know, we do talk about, when she can't talk for herself, but there was times through her disease, she had restrictive lung disease, She had numerous issues with her neck and spine that really affected her mobility, leaving her with drop foot. Through the years, she fell and broke her hip, had multiple hospitalizations. So through that time, I'm not saying that she was totally incompetent. I'm not saying, but there were times where she was really tired and really sick and not able to advocate for herself. So she may have been the person telling me what she wanted, but I was the person that had to insert myself into the system and get that for her. Whether it was, one time she was at the hospital and we couldn't get the doctor to come see her, so she could hit the call bell, and the nurse could come in and they could say, oh, well, he's on his way. But it was me who could really start calling people and say, okay, it's been 2 days. This is ridiculous.
Right.
And I think, again, that advocate for healthcare is really important. There's a statistic I just heard somebody say, and I know it was true in my mom's situation. For every day that somebody is in the hospital who's, older, they're going to have to spend about a week in therapy to get back to where they were. And so when we talk about mom falls, we go to the emergency room. Sometimes there's not any beds in the emergency room and we're in a hallway. And then finally we wait and she's admitted to the hospital and she spends 2 or 3 days there to be checked out. We're adding on to that a 2-week stay at a rehab so she can make sure she can still walk, because now she's laid in a bed for 2 days. And so, I remember one time she was at a hospital and, I'd been there every day. And even though it was about 45 minutes away from my house, every single day I'd been there. And one day I walk in and they're telling me that she's being discharged to a nursing home. And please know there's no problem with nursing homes. We often have people who are my clients, utilize nursing homes. But in this circumstance, it didn't make sense with my mom's diagnosis and her condition. She had been at a personal care home, and there was really no reason she couldn't go back to that personal care home, except for that she needed therapy. And so I said, no, she's not. No, she's not. And, they handed me a list of the local places. And but I knew that the nursing home actually wasn't the best placement for her because they're really many of them in the list that they had given me are more tuned towards, I'm going to be admitted there, I'm going to get therapy, and then I'm often going to stay there. So one of the things anybody can do if you want to look at this is you can get on the CMS guidance, website, the Medicare website, and you can see how many times somebody's admitted to a facility and they end up being discharged. And the facilities they were showing me was 25%, And I knew that my mom would be better off at a short-term rehab where their whole goal was to get her back walking and then discharge her back to her community living. And for some people, that's their home. For some people, that's a personal care home, but, kind of aging in place where she was at. And I would say to you that, my mom was able to really age in place, partly because I was able to be a fierce advocate for her and getting the health care she needed. And if I didn't have that power of attorney, I wouldn't have been able to do that. You don't even get, access to information. Now, access is really a HIPAA release federally, which sometimes they go hand in hand, that they can be also a separate document. Before we leave the power of attorney thing, though, I really want to make sure we also think about, from the perspective of that power of attorney, the burden that it causes. And again, this was helpful that my brother and I were able to do it together and we're involved. But the burden that it involves of, okay, mom's in the hospital. I've just spent all this time with her. I've advocated for her to get the best care. And sometimes that was really hard. And then I leave the hospital and I have to call everybody. I have to call everybody and ask them what the update is. Like, this is what I know. And sometimes, people are asking a lot of questions I didn't know the answers to. Thought I had done a good job until they asked those questions. And so I think too, when we think about caregiving, even if you're the person that's listening and you're not the power of attorney, and maybe you're wanting a whole bunch of information, maybe you can get a HIPAA release and you can call the doctor yourself. And that's not a bad thing. You just have to understand the person that's on the front lines, it's a hard job. And having to retell the story again and again is really difficult.
And I think that's why sometimes, you said something about the out-of-town kid earlier. And I think that's a really good point, because sometimes, like, you would call me, especially when Nan, was at the hospital 45 minutes away. Sometimes you were calling people, but sometimes you were calling me on your way
Mm-hmm.
home. And sometimes it was to talk about what's going on with Nan, but sometimes it was just to talk about, God, anything else.
Right.
And so, as the out of town kids, sometimes they come back into town and people get upset because they're like, well, why didn't you do this, this, and this? And sometimes it's because, like, my goodness, you had just told the story of what had happened to Nan for the last couple of days to 6 different people to get her the care. The thought of, like, telling me then that, and it was never anything bad that you didn't want me to know, but sometimes it was bullet points because you literally just can't go through it again. And so I think, as the out of town kid, getting the HIPAA release so that they can get their own information, so it doesn't feel so shocking when something happens, because you're not there every day. You can't see it with your own eyes. And then, you're rehashing the story and you're going through all of this stuff. And so I think, one place to be helpful was, when you were driving home from those hospitals, to talk to you about anything else.
Yeah, absolutely.
Because you just keep going through it and it can be so hard. And so, we talk about caregiving and supporting the person, but there's also the support of the caregivers, which is sometimes what my main role through NANS was really talking to you about different things. Luckily, we work together. So sometimes it's talking about work and I'm able to push things forward so that you could go talk to Nan. Sometimes it was literally you and I talking about anything else, just to, kind of give your brain a break.
Yeah, and I think it's kind of going down this rabbit hole, segueing out of the powers of attorneys, because we're using the word rehashing, and I think it's really important for everybody to know. I did a lot of work with what's called heart math, and heart math is, one of the things that taught me was, like, we think about time that we have, but we also think about using our energy. And I try very much to not waste my energy on things. And so even, take it out of the caregiver, even like if you have a bad day at the office, coming home and telling 3 people about that's rehashing it. And there's a question of, is that good for you at all? Because it takes so much energy. And so I don't like rehashing. I don't like, if there's something happening at the office, I don't come home and talk about it because I don't want to rehash it. And unless I'm going to do something constructive about it, all I'm doing is just like using my energy on something that's probably negative. And so I tend not to want to do that. And I share that with people because I also, if you're feeling overwhelmed, I think you have to watch yourself and how much you rehash and retell the story. And if you're, somebody who's expecting that caregiver to do that, you're asking them to give you some of their energy. And is that what we want to do? It's really even true when we think about anybody who gets a diagnosis, there's a lot of work done on, people who have a cancer diagnosis and, not asking them to rehash that story. So that's what we all want to do. Somebody, it tells you, I've been diagnosed with some disease, such as cancer, and we want to know more about it. And they're probably not the best questions because we really are asking somebody to rehash that. And, that becomes very stressful, can even lead, to like post-traumatic stress because you keep retelling it. And I think, again, in this whole idea of supporting caregivers, understanding more of what they're going through. And I think sometimes, one of the things I learned, really from a a women's group I used to be a part of, Women on Fire, and the person who it was a good part of that, Rob Berkeley, who's also passed away. He really taught me that when I was checking in on somebody to always put, you don't have to respond.
Yeah.
But I'm thinking about you. So rather than asking the question, how's your day? Right? Because that's a question that I'm supposed to respond to. And now I feel like I didn't respond, and I feel bad about that.
You also have to think about, like, how's your day? Well, sometimes that's a complicated question.
Right, true.
Am I going to lie and say, like, it's fine, and then, just pretend that everything's fine? Or am I really going to get into it in a text message, like, well, this, and this went wrong, right? So, like, sometimes, like, people think, like, how's your day? It's actually a more complicated question than you think.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely. So, again, in this whole idea of even if, like, you're not the power of attorney, even if you're, not just, but your role is really just supporting that caregiver. I think knowing that you can learn how to do that better, don't ask them to rehash, reach out and support them by texting or calling, but not always making it about, well, what did you do? Did you do a good job? Did you ask this? Did you do this? Because like, it's like kind of shell shock. Like, well, I tried, and please know I'm talking to everybody out there. Like, I do this for a living. And it was hard, like, and that it wasn't just about the fact that it was my mom and I had an emotional component. Of course, that was part of it, but also it's just a tough job.
Right.
And so the support that I wanted wasn't somebody who questioned what I did, but rather somebody who was supporting what I was going through, and not asking that rehashing or expecting me to respond one more time. Now, please know, there's obviously, I talked about the fact that my brother and I were both the power of attorneys. We were both equal decision makers, as an or, either one of us. And I had to talk to him sometimes because I had to tell him, like, where I left off. Like, if I was tagging him back in, he kind of needed to know what I knew.
Right.
And so that, but it's a little different than I think sometimes what people, put up with. I know at my office, a lot of times I'll hear people who will talk about, that hospital admission and just how hard it is to communicate with the rest of the family. And so if you're part of the rest of the family and not on the front lines, think about, you're upset and you really need to know what's going on with your loved one, and you have every right to know that. But when you're trying to get that information, remember that the person that you're asking is doing the best job they can, and it's not perfect. It's hard to get good information and make good decisions. And I'm definitely a person that like double guesses myself. So I, always did. But one of the things my husband would always say is you made the best decision with the information you had at the time. And Courtney, you kind of said that you kind of have that same mentality as your dad does, that would always make me feel better because I wanted the best for her.
Right.
So, so whether you're the power of, well, first of all, if you yourself don't have a power of attorney, if you're caring for somebody that doesn't have a power of attorney, the advice today is go get one. And at the end of the podcast, we'll talk about, a website that we have where people can get on and try and find, a local attorney that can do that. But also you may have your own attorney, go back to that person. And if you say to yourself, I already did powers of attorneys years ago, I would say to you, they're the part of the law that changes the most in some states. And so it's a good idea to call back that person and make sure your forms are the most up to date. There's also a lot of issues with powers of attorneys because they're state driven, but we use them for companies in different states. And so sometimes one company sit in a different state and they want different wording. So it's an evolving area of the law. And then we also have to add, like, practically, does it work, right? So I would say to you, go back to whoever you went to and ask them, is this updated? I also would say to you, think about who you appointed as the decision maker and really be honest with yourself. Is that the person that you want to speak for you for those issues? I'll always remember doing, powers of attorneys for my Aunt Ruth Ann. I love her to death. She has 6 kids. They grew up right beside me. And, she wanted everybody to have a job. Now, most times my clients actually listen to me, and I'll be like, "Oh, you can't have 6 people do that." Aunt Ruthann, not so much. But that's what she wants, and so we can talk about that. But I also do think it depends on the family. So I think that some families know how to have conflict better than others. I can just talk about my own family. My brother and I, our parents got divorced. And, in the 80s, they used to call them dysfunctional families. But I think the gift that all of that gave us is that we do know how to have conflict with each other. If I didn't agree with my brother, I was able to tell him. We would fight it out, and we'd come to a resolution, and then we both could go in that manner. And I see lots of families who aren't able to do that. They've never had conflict with each other or with their parent. And so they're not able to have those real conversations. And that makes us really hard. That's another reason that caregiving is so hard. Some people talk about the idea that you bring baggage with you. I think that's true, but in my career, I think it's more true that people haven't figured out how to have that conflict, how to have a differing opinion figured out. And that's among siblings. And then also with parents,
When I think conflict is, people think of it as a bad word, like, oh, we don't want to fight. Sometimes fighting it out is the way to go, right?
Yeah.
So, you and Dad have been married for 30 years, but you brought the conflict, like, Steph, DJ, and I'll just fight it out,
Yep.
you know what I mean? And so, if we disagree, now I will say I'm 6 years older than Steph and 8 years older than DJ. So are we fighting it out, or am I imposing my will? I'm not
But
sure.
at least they have a voice.
But, they can get it out. If I listen, maybe. If I don't, totally fine. But, I think, that's what really matters. And so, the point of all of this to kind of go down this legal thing is to really talk about, it's important. And Nan had these documents, and now we're going to get into some things that were still hard, even though she had all of the right things in place. And we obviously knew what we were doing. You live in this space. And so we started this podcast with a story about, the condo in Maine. And so I understand that, people might not have a beach house or a property or something like that, but there's something from Nan that's something from the person that you're caring for that's important, that you want to preserve, that there's memories attached to. It could be their house, right? If they go into a facility or a personal care home or something like that. And we had this condo. And so, in 2020, she moved into the personal care home a little bit before that. And so we decided, to try renting it to travel nurses because it's expensive to keep up on another property. And, I kind of took on that rental manager role. You live in Boston, so an hour and a half from Maine, and you guys are in Pennsylvania, so that was more complicated. But I think, what's really important is, we went through all the appropriate steps, and there's all kinds of stuff. You're dealing with business licenses and all this stuff. And so every year you have to renew the business license, which I didn't think was that big of a deal because the decision makers haven't changed.
Right. Absolutely. Yeah. We already had,
all of the stuff.
Wills, trust, moved the property. Yeah. The decision makers hadn't changed.
But according to the town of Old Orchard Beach, because she had
the lovely town that it is.
It is.
It's beautiful.
It really is. But in their mind, because she had passed, we now need a new business license. So even though the management of it hasn't changed, and it's really just gone from her into to the kids. And I explained this to the lovely woman at the, the business license office. No condolences were offered when I, gave my sob story. And, every year I would usually go up for a day or two and just check on the place. You can get big snowstorms in Maine, and, I haven't been able to go. And I even blocked it on my calendar 2 different times. I was going to go up, and the one day it was raining, and I was like, oh, I'm not going to drive in the rain. And, another time I was like, I just don't want to. I just can't, I can't walk in there. And so I decided that I was going to wait until June, and you and I were going to do it together. Because I just didn't want to go by myself.
We can just cry together.
We can cry together. We'll take the box of tissues and we'll cry together, and we'll be fine. Well, now I have to go in April. because the business license expires at the end of April, and we're renting the apartment and the condo, and I need to get it inspected by the firefighters. So in April, I'm going to go up, box of Puffs Plus in hand,
Mm-hmm.
and I'm going to
The square ones.
the square ones,
Yeah.
not the rectangular ones. Those were the ones that she preferred.
Yes, absolutely.
And I'm going to sit in the kitchen and I'm going to cry while the chief of fire checks the smoke detectors.
Yes.
Like he did a couple of years ago. These are 10-year-long smoke detectors. They should be fine. But because the town has decided that it's under new management and all this stuff, we have to get it re-inspected. It's not something that I anticipated having happen. And it has to kind of happen quickly. Like they just emailed me. I didn't think I'd have to get it re-inspected. And so, I'm traveling DJs. My brother's graduating from high school or from college.
College, God love him.
God love him. He did it in 3 years. And so, it's just one more thing to add. And it's something that like, I can't really tell the town of Old Orchard Beach. Like I tried to get some sort of sympathy. Like I can't call them and say, well I can't do this.
Right.
Because you have to.
Right.
And it's going to be hard. And it's just kind of have to be okay. And
I feel bad for the fire chief.
I know. Honestly, though, maybe they learn that when somebody says that somebody passed away, maybe they give somebody an extension. Like maybe this will be a learning experience for the chief of fire. I forget who comes. It's somebody from the town, I think, and the chief of fire. And yeah, like it just is what it is. And if I'm sitting there crying, I'm sitting there crying. Like I don't really know, but it's got to get done.
Right. Well, I think the point to, for everybody is that we're not saying these regulations aren't important. They are. They're fire regulations. And I don't want anybody to take away that we don't think they're really important. We really, really do. And we're glad that they have them. I think the issue is, though, like even in other podcast episodes, we'll talk about wills and trusts. But in this circumstance, we already had the wills done. We had the trust done. We had already dealt with really everything. And even with that, there is these unexpected things that come up, such as renewing the license for the renters at a condo that we've decided as a family to keep because it was so important to her. And so, and it has become very important also to the grandkids. And so, we've decided to do that. And Courtney's giving you an example of one thing that, like, she's going to have to do that she didn't think about doing. But she has to figure it in. I also, on my side, and just to give you kind of some, again, actionable items, one of the things you should know is that, and whether somebody's actually passed away yet or they're just, dealing with dementia or a long disease, there's a huge amount of financial exploitation in this country. There's a huge amount of scams. So at our office, when somebody passes away, we contact the 3 credit reporting agencies and let them know that the person has passed away. And so they put that on the credit so that nobody else can get credit in their names. And what you need to know is in many states, when you have to probate a will, or file any type of inheritance tax or estate tax, even, I would say to you, even in an obituary, all the information that you need to steal somebody's identity is right there. There's some people who say, don't put a lot of that information anymore in obituaries. So my suggestion to you is, you can work with a law office, but this is also something you yourself can do if your loved one is dealing with a diagnosis or has passed away. My suggestion is to let the credit reporting agencies know that the person's deceased or put a freeze hold on their credit during their life. Don't tell them they're deceased if they're not.
Right. Like we don't want to be like, we called, 6 months before Nan passed and be like, no more.
But we want, that's it's kind of one of those other things that like people can be very, very, prepared, do all the legal things right. And there's still more things that need to be done. And this is one of them. And so it's really, really important. I went to a conference by the ABA, Council on Aging. And at that conference years ago, I learned that about half of the people in this country will end up with a form of dementia, and Alzheimer's is a form of that. And about half the people who get dementia will end up being financially exploited. And I really carry that with me as an attorney because I think to myself, like on a Monday at my office, I often meet with 4 families. And I have to think about, wow, am I doing enough planning for them that half of them are going to end up getting dementia? Do we have the right decision makers, those types of things? And then one of those people, just statistically, might be financially exploited or scammed. And we'll do maybe a whole episode on this, but my point right now to you is like you have to think about those things, and anybody can contact the credit reporting agencies and report that somebody either freeze their credit if they're still alive, or report that somebody has passed away, so that nobody can bring out any new credit for them. So important for people to know. The next thing, though, Court, is probably, I'll be honest with you, something I wish I knew beforehand. When she passed away, I was still getting all the junk mail,
Oh, yeah.
Very good charities, but I don't need 10 things a day about these charities. I feel like in some ways they should have been paying me to get rid of, all the paper. But after she passed away, I asked actually my executive assistant to help me, write letters to let these people know, stop mailing to her. She has passed away. And there is a national do not mail list, and you can just Google that and get yourself on that list. And it's something I wish I had done even when she was sick, because we're at a point in time where she wasn't able to, pay her bills, and I had to sit down and pay her bills. And, this being the Hey Woman podcast, I had to do it in a way that Nana liked it, which was,
Which is not necessarily the way you innately pay your bill. So you're thinking about decision makers, like, sure, you can pay the bills, but did you fill out her check register exactly the way that she wanted it filled out? And she still, most of us, it's all online banking. We're not filling out a check register. Like, I can't even tell you the last time I wrote a check, right? Like, all of my stuff gets automatically paid to my credit card. That gets withdrawn from my bank account. She's kind of, she's still writing checks.
Oh, not only is she writing the check, I have to write the check. I have to put the check with the bill, right on the bill that it was paid by check number such and such on such and such a date. Then take those 2 pieces of paper, put it in a copy machine, make a copy of it, bring that copy back, put it in a file folder, and then put the file folder, the proper file folder. So if it was like the phone bill, put that with all the rest of them. So what could take, 30 seconds, takes, 10 minutes.
I help law firms with profitability and productivity. Some of those law firms don't have as extensive of an AP process as she did. I mean, if we're being honest about what it really took.
Yeah. And I think, so in this situation, I'm talking about, getting on those do not mail lists so you don't have to deal with all of the, solicitations coming in. But also it brings us back to one of the things that we talked about in the first episode, which is, I was the power of attorney, and my personality is different than hers. And at times I could fight that and be like, I do not have the time for this. Or I could consciously make the choice to lean into that really made her happy, and that she could be as much of a part of it as possible. And so if it was, at some points in times, to be honest with you, it was her job to put the stamps on the envelope. But that was a good night for her. I came in, it was important that her bills were paid. I never exactly filled out the check register quite as well as it should have been. Let's be honest. I didn't do it perfectly. I sometimes, be waiting for the bank statement to come to reconcile the check for the one I forgot to write in. But in caregiving, it's hard. And I chose, maybe not as early as I should have, but at some point in time, I chose to stop fighting how different we were as people and to lean in and to serve her in the way that she needed to be served. And that really means that I did copy those checks perfectly and file them away, even though I knew that it wasn't necessary. And I didn't fight her on that. So always an interesting thing to be thinking about. Well, I think what we've tried to do today is talk a little bit more about our journey with Nana. On this Hey Woman podcast, and talk about things that are important. Cortney talked about going to the condo, and how now after she's passed, we certainly had great plans in place, but even now after she's passed, there's more to do. And I think that's important, though, and we've certainly spent a lot of time in making sure her stuff gets to where she wants it to. She certainly had extensive lists about who gets what, and following that. But the point is that you have to plan ahead. You have to plan ahead. You've got to get powers of attorneys in place. We've got to get wills and trusts in place. And even with that, this is where we're at in the grief journey, which is we're shocked. Even with that, this is hard.
It is.
It's hard. There's stuff to do that we don't want to do. I
think that's okay. So knowing that I have to go to Maine because it's important and it needs done, and being able to say out loud that I really don't want to, that doesn't mean that you're not going to do it. And it doesn't mean that I don't know that it's important. But it's really okay to stand up and say, I don't want to do this. And sometimes we have to. I'm not a little kid anymore who's going through the grief process. Life doesn't stop. And so it's okay that I don't want to. And sometimes just there's a freeing in just being able to say that out loud.
Yeah, absolutely. And being able to say that out loud and to be honest about it. I certainly don't want to have to deal with any more of the junk mail that I have to deal with. And I also don't want, have to deal with, her identity getting stolen, which is a huge, huge problem in this country. Well, as people have listened, what can we ask of our listeners?
Yeah, so we're definitely going to ask you guys to subscribe to the podcast, wherever you get your podcasts, to follow us on social media, to leave us a review. If you've listened to this and you don't have stuff in order for yourself, for somebody that you're caring for, we really urge you to go to the Planning and Protecting website, so planningandprotecting.com, and that'll allow you to find an attorney in your local area. It'll also give great downloads, free resources. If you are an elder law and estate planning attorney and you go to that website, you'll find people who are like-minded, and you'll be able to connect with them. And so we hope that you've spent this last little bit with us learning a little bit more about Nan and the complicated little woman that she was. And we hope that you got some actionable advice and know that it's okay to run the full gamut of emotions while caregiving and going through grief, and that this is a safe space for that, and that we appreciate you listening in as we try to replace these phone calls that we would have had with her.
Yeah, absolutely. Hey Woman is hopefully for you a safe space that feels like that phone call to somebody who's traveled the journey of raising children and caring for a loved one and being a granddaughter and, walking through all of that. And so thanks for listening to us today. And we hope to hear you, feel you, so that you're not alone, and neither are we on future episodes.